The fire raged like a hungry beast, licking the sky with fiery tongues as smoke billowed into the night air. Sirens wailed in the distance, a desperate cry for urgency, but the paramedics were met with an obstacle no one expected. A middle-aged woman in an overpriced blazer and pearls, standing with arms crossed at the entrance of the gated community. Her expression was one of sheer annoyance, as if they had interrupted an important board meeting instead of responding to a life-threatening emergency. "I'm sorry," Karen said, her voice laced with the forced patience of someone who had spent far too much time on power trips. "But without proper clearance, I can't let you in." The paramedic at the front, a man who had likely seen all forms of human stupidity, stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have a 911 call reporting a house fire. We need to get through now." Karen sighed dramatically, glancing at her clipboard, as if the burning house were some minor inconvenience on her schedule. "This is a private community. We have protocols to maintain order. If we start letting people in willy-nilly, what's next? Pizza delivery guys? Unregistered guests?" She scoffed. "I can't just open the gates every time someone claims there's an emergency. Rules are rules." Behind her, several residents had gathered, whispering among themselves, their faces a mixture of concern and frustration. One of them, a man in a bathrobe, took a cautious step forward. "Karen, maybe just this once." "Just this once?" She cut him off with a haughty laugh. "That's what they said about those Christmas lights in March, and look where that got us. We are a civilized, well-managed community. If these people don't have the right clearance, then they don't get in." The firefighter clenched his jaw. "Lady, someone could die." Karen rolled her eyes. "And someone could be lying. We have to be sure." As if on cue, the wind shifted, and a thick plume of black smoke drifted over them, stinging their eyes. The smell of burning wood and chemicals filled the air, undeniable proof that a house was, in fact, on fire. The firefighter turned to his team. "We're breaking through." "Absolutely not," Karen snapped, stepping in front of the gate. "I will call security. You will wait for approval, or you will be charged with trespassing." One of the younger paramedics muttered something under his breath that was probably not very professional. The firefighter, clearly at his limit, turned back to Karen with a look that suggested he was considering whether or not dragging her out of the way would be worth the paperwork. At that moment, Karen's phone rang. She huffed, stepping back just enough to answer it. "Hello?" she said in her usual clipped tone. On the other end, a voice wheezed through the receiver, barely recognizable. "Karen," her husband Todd gasped. "The house, it's our house. It's on fire. I'm trapped upstairs, help." For the first time that night, Karen's confident posture faltered. Her face drained of color, her grip on the phone tightening as if holding on to reality itself. "What?" she whispered. "The fire. Our house. Get them in, for God's sake, get them in." Todd's voice was growing weaker, the sound of crackling flames in the background sending a jolt of terror through Karen's spine. She turned back to the firefighters, eyes wide with dawning horror. It's my house," she stammered. The paramedic who had been arguing with her didn't even blink. "Move." Without another word, Karen stumbled aside as the team rushed past her, slamming the emergency override on the gate. The moment it buzzed open, they surged forward, engines roaring, sirens blaring, disappearing into the smoke-filled street. Karen stood frozen, her mind unable to process the sheer irony of what had just happened. She had blocked the very people who could save her own home, her own husband. The crowd around her started murmuring, some looking at her with pity, others with well-deserved frustration. A woman shook her head. "Unbelievable!" Karen snapped out of her shock, suddenly running after the firefighters, her expensive heels clacking against the pavement. "Hurry! You have to save him! You have to!" By the time she reached her street, it was chaos. Flames climbed her house, devouring everything in their path. The windows had shattered, sending bursts of heat across the lawn. Neighbors stood outside, some watching in horror, others with grim expressions that suggested karma had just performed a well-executed pirouette. Karen's perfect world was collapsing before her eyes. The pristine white fence, the imported garden statues, the grand oak door she had custom-ordered, all of it was now glowing embers, reduced to nothing in the relentless heat. One of the firefighters burst out of the house, carrying Todd over his shoulder. His face was blackened with soot, his body limp. Karen let out a strangled cry, rushing forward as they placed him on a stretcher. Todd, are you okay? He coughed, eyes barely open. Took you long enough, he rasped. The words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time, Karen realized, truly realized, what she had done. Her obsession with control, her blind adherence to rules, had nearly cost her husband's life. Mr. Whiskers, their spoiled Persian cat, was cradled in another firefighter's arms, looking equally traumatized. The cat let out a low, irritated meow, as if personally blaming her for the night's catastrophe. Karen stood there, helpless, as they wheeled Todd into the ambulance. The community members watched in silence. Some whispered. Others shook their heads. One of them, Mr. Patel, the man she had once fined for having a garden gnome too whimsical for the neighborhood aesthetic, took a long sip from his thermos before saying, "Well, guess the rules don't always work in your favor, huh?" No one laughed, but the point landed hard. Karen swallowed, her throat dry, her pride nowhere to be found. As the ambulance doors shut, as the firefighters continued battling the blaze, she realized the terrible truth. She had spent years ruling over this community, believing herself above them. But tonight, she was just another helpless woman who had made the biggest mistake of her life. And this mistake had cost her everything. Karen's hands trembled as she stood near the ambulance, watching Todd struggle to breathe through an oxygen mask. The paramedics moved swiftly, checking his vitals, asking him questions, ensuring he was stable. But all Karen could hear was the ringing in her ears, the sound of flames consuming everything she had spent years perfecting. The house, the expensive furniture, the carefully curated decor that had taken months to select, all of it was gone in an instant. Yet, none of that mattered compared to the man lying in the ambulance, barely conscious, all because of her own stubbornness. She turned toward the smoldering wreckage that had once been her home. The firefighters were still battling the remaining flames, but the structure itself was unsalvageable. Her perfectly trimmed hedges, the grand stone pathway leading up to the front door, even the ridiculous but expensive fountain she had insisted on installing in the front yard, everything was either charred or buried under debris. It was like staring at the ruins of a life she had controlled so obsessively, only to realize she had never really been in control at all. The crowd of neighbors hadn't dispersed. They lingered on the sidewalks, some murmuring to each other, others simply watching her with a mixture of pity and quiet satisfaction. She recognized their faces, people she had fined, scolded, and ruled over with an iron fist for years. Mrs. Clark, whose teenage son Karen had tried to get expelled from the community pool for playing music too loudly. The Andersons, whom she had once threatened with legal action over a mailbox that didn't match the HOA-approved color scheme. And of course, Mr. Patel, the man with the infamous garden gnome. He was still holding his thermos, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite smug, but wasn't exactly sympathetic either. Karen swallowed hard, turning toward the security gate she had so fiercely defended earlier. It stood there, a silent monument to her own foolishness. The fire trucks had gotten through, but only because they had forcibly overridden the system. She had built so many barriers, literal and figurative, to keep things exactly as she wanted, and tonight, those barriers had nearly cost her the only person who truly mattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a flood of notifications. Her name was already circulating online. Someone had recorded the argument at the gate. The video had spread like wildfire, with titles that made her stomach turn. HOA tyrant blocks paramedics, instant karma. Karen refuses to open gate, Doesn't realize it's her own house burning. The comment sections were ruthless. People were laughing at her. Some were furious. Others were just in disbelief. The weight of it all hit her at once. The loss. The humiliation. The sheer stupidity of her actions. Her knees felt weak, and for the first time in years, Karen, the unstoppable force of the Maple Ridge Estates HOA, felt powerless. A hand landed on her shoulder. She turned to see the fire chief, his face covered in soot and sweat, his expression unreadable. "Your husband's stable for now," he said. "But you should be thankful the paramedics got here when they did. Another 5 minutes, and it would have been a different story." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? Sorry? Thank you? Neither felt strong enough to undo what had happened. The fire chief sighed, glancing at the wreckage behind them. "We've seen a lot of things in this job. But tonight? That's a first." He shook his head, then turned back to his team. Karen watched him walk away, her face burning, not from the heat of the fire, but from the shame curling in her chest. She wanted to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare and go back to a time when she was in control. But there was no going back. Only forward. She took a deep breath and approached the ambulance, where Todd was still lying with the oxygen mask over his face. His eyes flickered open when she stepped closer. For a brief moment she thought he might say something, anything, to reassure her that things would be okay. But when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "You almost got me killed." The words cut deeper than anything she had read online, deeper than the looks of judgment from her neighbors. Todd wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was just tired. And that made it so much worse. "I didn't know," she whispered, reaching for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hold on either. "You didn't listen," he corrected. "That's the problem." Karen blinked rapidly, her throat tightening. She wanted to defend herself, to say it wasn't her fault, that she was just following rules, that she had been trying to do the right thing. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. She had ignored the urgency. She had refused to listen, just like she always did. The paramedics started preparing to transport Todd to the hospital, gently nudging Karen aside. She stepped back, watching as they loaded him into the ambulance. Mr. Whiskers, wrapped in a towel, was placed on the seat beside him, still glaring at the world like he had personally been betrayed by the night's events. The doors shut, and just like that, the ambulance drove off, leaving Karen standing alone in the middle of the street, surrounded by people who had spent years suffering under her rule. She turned back toward the crowd. The murmuring had died down, but the air was thick with unspoken words. She wasn't just the woman who lost her house tonight. She was the woman who had prioritized authority over human lives. Mr. Patel took a step forward, taking another long sip from his thermos. "You gonna be okay?" he asked, but there was no real warmth in his voice, just the obligation of politeness. Karen straightened her shoulders, trying to regain even a sliver of the composure she had lost. "I don't know," she admitted. The words tasted foreign coming out of her mouth. For once, she didn't have all the answers. A long silence stretched between her and the rest of the community. Some people started leaving, others lingered, waiting for her to say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe an acknowledgement of what had happened. But she had no idea what they wanted from her. She had no idea what she wanted from herself. She turned back to the remains of her house, watching as the last flames were extinguished. She had spent years making sure Maple Ridge Estates was perfect, and now she was the biggest stain on its reputation. For the first time in her life, Karen realized that she wasn't the one in control, and she had no idea what to do next. Karen sat on the edge of the hospital chair, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the air, a sharp contrast to the thick smoke she had inhaled just hours earlier. Todd lay in the hospital bed, his face pale, his arm wrapped in a bandage, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. He wasn't hooked up to any machines, which was a small mercy, but the exhaustion in his eyes told her that this wasn't just about the fire. It was about everything that had led to it. She had spent the past hour rehearsing what to say. A simple apology didn't feel like enough, but she had never been good at admitting she was wrong. Even now, as guilt sat heavy on her shoulders, she found herself wanting to justify, to explain, to somehow make it seem like she hadn't completely failed. But the truth was undeniable. She had let her own rules, her own arrogance, endanger the person she was supposed to protect the most. Todd shifted slightly, groaning as he adjusted himself against the pillow. He opened his eyes, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Karen forced a weak smile, but he didn't return it. "They said you'll be okay," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Some smoke inhalation, but no permanent damage." Todd nodded, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Karen swallowed hard, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would make her feel like there was still a way to fix this. But he just stared at the ceiling, his fingers absent-mindedly rubbing at the scratch marks Mr. Whiskers had left on his arm during the rescue. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I don't think you realize how close I was to not making it." Karen flinched at the bluntness of his words. "I do," she said quickly. "I do, Todd, and I—" "No," he cut her off, finally looking at her. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. "I don't think you do. Because if you did, you wouldn't have to think so hard about what to say to me right now." Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had nothing to counter with. No defense, no excuse, no way to deflect the weight of her own actions. Todd saw right through her. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I was calling you. Over and over. I could barely breathe, I could barely see, and all I could think about was how stupid it was that I was about to die in my own house because my wife wouldn't let the damn fire trucks in." Karen winced. Hearing it phrased like that made it all so much worse. "I didn't know it was you," she whispered, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. "That's not the point, Karen." Todd's voice was calm, but firm. "It shouldn't have mattered whose house it was. You should have let them in the second they said there was an emergency." Karen's nails pressed harder into her palms, leaving little crescent-shaped marks on her skin. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Todd let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's the problem. You always think you're right. Always. It's never about what's actually right, just what you think should be right. Rules over common sense. Authority over reason. Control over everything." He turned his head away. "And this time, it almost killed me." Tears burned at the back of Karen's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had never been someone who cried, especially not when people were watching. But Todd wasn't just anyone, and tonight had broken something inside of her that she didn't know how to fix. "I don't know how to change," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had ever admitted. Todd was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less firm. "Then maybe you should figure that out. Because I can't keep living like this." Karen's heart clenched. She knew what he meant. She wanted to argue, to tell him that they had been married for too long to just throw everything away. But she also knew Todd didn't make empty threats. If he was saying this, he meant it. Before she could say anything else, a knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in, smiling politely. "Mr. Wallace, we need to take you for a few more tests." Todd nodded, not looking at Karen as the nurse wheeled his bed toward the hallway. Karen stayed behind, sitting motionless in the empty hospital room, staring at the blank wall. By the time she left the hospital, the sun was beginning to rise. The cool morning air stung against her skin as she walked through the parking lot. She had nowhere to go. Her house was gone. Her husband wasn't sure if he wanted to stay married to her. The one thing she had always clung to, her power over Maple Ridge Estates, was slipping through her fingers. She had barely taken a few steps before she noticed the group of neighbors standing near their cars. They weren't whispering anymore. They were looking directly at her. Karen squared her shoulders, ready for whatever lecture, whatever insults, whatever judgment they were about to throw her way. But instead, Mr. Patel took a step forward and said, "So, what happens now?" It was a simple question, but Karen had no answer. For the first time in years, she didn't have a plan. She didn't have an excuse. She didn't even know who she was without the title of HOA president hanging over her head. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The words wouldn't come. A week later, the Homeowners Association held an emergency vote. It wasn't even a close call. Karen was officially removed as president. The position she had once ruled with absolute authority was handed over to someone else. And for the first time, the residents of Maple Ridge Estates felt a weight lift off their shoulders. Karen moved into a small rental on the other side of town, a place with no HOA, no gates, no rules she could enforce. It was quiet. It was simple. And it was lonely. She spent the first few days in a haze, scrolling through social media, watching as the video of her refusing entry to the Paramedics continued to spread. She saw the memes, the comments, the debates over whether she was the worst person alive or just another out-of-touch HOA dictator. But what hit the hardest were the people who had once feared her, now openly mocking her. She thought about reaching out to Todd. But what would she even say? Sorry? It wasn't enough. Not anymore. 3 months later, she saw a flyer for a neighborhood committee meeting in her new area. They were looking for volunteers to help organize events, handle disputes, make sure everything ran smoothly. The kind of role she would have jumped at without hesitation in the past. She stared at the flyer for a long time. Then, for the first time in her life, she walked past it without picking it up.